announcing the arrival of Her Excellency Miss Helen Clark, accompanied by the Honourable Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Malaysia. The Honourable Datuk Sri Rizal Merican Naina Merican, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Her Excellency Miss Helen Clark, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme and Chair of the United Nations Development Group, Miss Michelle Giles McDonough, United Nations Resident Coordinator for Malaysia, Excellencies, Ambassadors and High Commissioners, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri, Datuk, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of IDFR, I would like to express a heartfelt welcome to everyone to today's program. And to begin this morning's event, I have the pleasure to invite the Honourable Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs to deliver his welcoming remarks. Please welcome.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Peace be upon you. Very good morning. Her Excellency Miss Helen Clark, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme and Chair of the United Nations Development Group, Miss Michelle Giles McDonough, United Resident Coordinator for Malaysia, United Nations Malaysia, Tan Sri Datuk Dr. Michael Yeo, Chief Executive Officer ASEAN Strategy and Leadership Institute ASLI, Madam Hajah Noraini Ibrahim, Acting Director General of IDFR, Excellencies, Member of Diplomatic Cooperation Corps, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, IDFR, to this public lecture series co-organized by IDFR, ASLI and the UNDP. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Her Excellency Miss Helen Clark to Malaysia. We are indeed very fortunate and privileged to have you with us this morning to share your thoughts and views on the key principle of the Sustainable Development Goals and how it can complement our endeavors to establish a people-oriented and people-centered ASEAN community. In a sense, our gathering today has come at a very opportune time, a time when the United Nations had just celebrated its 70th anniversary, a time when world leaders have just adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and a time when ASEAN is in process of launching the ASEAN Community at the 27th ASEAN Summit here in Kuala Lumpur next month. The world today is facing many challenges: poverty, unemployment, frequent and devastating natural disasters, global health threats, violent extremism and radicalism, and also terrorism, environmental degradation, climate change, and many more, which are detrimental to human livelihoods and well-being. Crucially, our leaders' decision to undertake bold and responsible commitment at this juncture demonstrate the mutual obligation and desire to provide a better and promising future for our peoples. I'm proud to say that Malaysia joins all countries and stakeholders in supporting and implementing these extraordinary plans. As chairman of ASEAN in 2015, Malaysia has set its priority areas, which among others include the creation of truly people-centered ASEAN. This will be an even more powerful vehicle for the realization of our people's aspiration for good governance, transparency, higher standards of living, sustainable development, the empowerment of women, and greater opportunity for all. A people-centered ASEAN also means a greater and deeper involvement of all sectors of society in ASEAN's works. It also means that ASEAN will no longer be the domain of the political and bureaucratic elites. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the sustainable goals are now acknowledged as the people's agenda. There are 17 universal goals in areas of critical importance to our people and the planet. These goals are comprehensive, inclusive, transformative, far-reaching, and people-centered. The SDGs have ambitious targets and will strive to meet the people's aspiration for a more peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable future. With these goals, countries will strive to end poverty and hunger everywhere, promote health, lives, and well-being for all, reduce inequalities within and among countries, build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, combat climate change, and also protect the planet and its natural resources. Countries will undertake measures to create sustainable, inclusive, and sustained economic growth, shared prosperity, and decent work for all, taking into account different levels of national development and capacities. Based on the above, we note that the elements outlined in the SDGs are in line and could complement ASEAN's effort in creating a people-centered ASEAN. We have and will always place our heart at the core of what we are doing. Every policy formulated, every decision made, every implementation of plans and projects will be focused towards the creation of a sustainable and greater future for our ASEAN citizens. As such, the SDGs and ASEAN's aspiration for a people-centered community are indeed in tandem, as both envisage to provide a conducive and harmonious living environment for our community. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, with this in mind, I'm of the view that we need to identify ways to align both the elements so as to ensure that they are correspond with each other. One way to do this is by utilizing the existing cooperation between ASEAN and the United Nations. The ASEAN-UN cooperation will soon enter a new phase, and I'm pleased to note that the recent ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting with the United Nations Secretary General and the President of the 70th session of United Nations General Assembly a few weeks ago in New York have agreed for ASEAN and UN to work and develop a five-year action plan encompassing the key elements of the ASEAN post-2015 vision and also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I'm encouraged by the UN's keen interest in this regard, and I hope the proposals and recommendations that come out of that meeting will be translated into concrete action in due course. On that note, I wish to reiterate Malaysia's unwavering support and commitment to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I would also like to express our gratitude and good friend to ASEAN, to United Nations for being a strong proponent and good friend to ASEAN. We are indeed thankful to the United Nations for its contribution to ASEAN community building efforts. Once again, we look with anticipation at what Her Excellency Ms. Helen Clark has to say on this important subject. Given the far-sighted vision and your hands-on involvement in formulation of SDGs, surely your address, Your Excellency, will definitely provide us with an insightful lesson and valuable lessons toward this important endeavor. I'm confident that together, ASEAN and UN, we are able to establish a forward-looking strategy for the post-2015 era. I thank you.
Thank you, Datuk Sri. Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the pleasure to invite Her Excellency Ms. Helen Clark, accompanied by Tan Sri Datuk Dr. Michael Yeo, on stage. Before that, ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs will be leaving for another official engagement. Tan Sri, the floor is yours.
Her Excellency Helen Clark, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme and Chair of the UN Development Group, Ms. Michelle McDonald, Resident Coordinator of UNDP, Excellencies, Tan Sri, Dr. Dato, ladies and gentlemen. It's my very great honor and pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for this morning. I had the honor of meeting Her Excellency Helen Clark for the first time in Auckland several years ago when she was Prime Minister of New Zealand and when she hosted me at the Asia New Zealand Foundation Program, Action Asia, that the New Zealand government organized several years ago. Today, Her Excellency Helen Clark has made her second or probably third visit to Malaysia in recent years, and I'm delighted to introduce some key highlights of her program, of her biography. Her Excellency became Administrator of the UNDP in 2009 and was the first woman to lead the organization. She is also chair of the United Nations Development Group, a committee consisting of the heads of all UN funds, programs, and departments working on development issues. And as we all know, prior to her appointment with UNDP, Her Excellency served for 9 years as Prime Minister of New Zealand. Throughout her tenure as Prime Minister, Her Excellency engaged widely in policy development and advocacy across the international, economic, social, and cultural spheres. Under her leadership, New Zealand achieved significant economic growth, low levels of unemployment, and high levels of investment in education and health in the well-being of families and older citizens. Her Excellency advocated strongly for New Zealand's comprehensive program on sustainability and for tackling the problems of climate change. So we have in Her Excellency a woman leader, and as Prime Minister, Her Excellency was a member of the Council of Women Leaders, an international network of current and former women presidents and prime ministers, whose mission is to mobilize the highest level of women leaders globally for collective action on issues of critical importance to women and equitable development. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and pleasure to present to you Her Excellency Helen Clark.
Thank you very much, Michael Yeo and the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute and the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations for hosting this public lecture today, titled The Sustainable Development Goals and Key Considerations for a People-Centred ASEAN. I've visited Malaysia in a number of capacities over the past couple of decades, but this is the first time I've been to the Institute, and I thank the Deputy Foreign Minister for being here to introduce our topic today, and also wish Malaysia all the best for a very successful ASEAN summit here in November. Of course, we've just come off the big summit in New York for the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 launch. I've really never known a General Assembly as busy and packed as this one was, with a major summit and so many other meetings. But this new agenda is titled Transforming Our World. And when you look at the 35 pages, you have to say it would be a very different world if the aspirations and goals and targets and yet to be concluded indicators for the new agenda truly are realised. And I thank the Deputy Foreign Minister for reiterating Malaysia's profound commitment to the new agenda, and also mentioning that in the 5-year action plan it's hoped to renew between the UN and ASEAN that this plan will have a focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda, and I think it will be very important to engage the UN Development Group very directly in that, because we are the practical people who work on development across the region, largely now a middle income region, and would very much like to see ASEAN as a whole be seen as extremely successful against the new agenda. So it is a bold agenda, it is an ambitious agenda, it is a transformational agenda, it's also a universal agenda. It applies to every country. And I often say when I'm speaking in developed countries that the message is that development isn't something which happens to somebody else somewhere else. It's about all of us and how we live, work, consume, carry out our lives, our industries. It has a lot of challenges for everyone, this new agenda. Interestingly, it's an agenda which also includes goals and targets which are about means as much as about ends. The Millennium Development Goals were known for very important end points in human development. For example, the goals on poverty and hunger and children in school and lowering infant, child and maternal deaths and so on. But these goals get into some of the how, the very important role of infrastructure, which has a goal, the critical role of modern energy, of information and communications technologies, and it also targets that fundamental precondition for development, which is peaceful and inclusive societies. And the agenda goes so far as to say there can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. I think the new agenda will be entirely consistent with the vision for a people-centred ASEAN community, which the ASEAN member states are currently finalising, I understand. And we're hearing out of ASEAN, as we heard from the Deputy Foreign Minister today, the same language of socially responsible, people-oriented, people-centred development that burns through as a message from the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. So let me talk a little bit more about the agenda, why it's needed, what are the big challenges it's taking on, and how it can be implemented. Putting it in its context, it does build on the Millennium Development Goals and the Millennium Declaration of 2000. Now, the Millennium Development Goals did span across human development and environmental sustainability. But in practice, the two sets of issues tended not to be dealt with in an holistic way. They were very much dealt with in silos. And I think what's important about this agenda is it is very consciously linking concerns of people and of planet, and saying what's good for one is also good for the other. There is a huge interdependence between human well-being and healthy ecosystems. I think we can say that for Malaysia, many of the Millennium Development Goal targets represented no serious challenge whatsoever. Indeed, many would have been met before the agenda was even launched. Malaysia in half a century has been transformed into an upper middle income country. Of course, that doesn't mean it has no development challenges, but they are of a different order. And the new SDGs are as highly relevant to Malaysia as the Universal Agenda is to all countries. And the truth is that it calls on every country on earth to lift its game. Environmental degradation is affecting the prospects of people everywhere. Growing inequalities are straining social cohesion in many countries. Lack of inclusive, effective and accountable institutions in others is creating tensions. And all of these challenges are covered in Agenda 2030. I think it's also important to put Agenda 2030 into the context of three other major development-related processes taking place at the UN global level this year. Already in March in Japan, there has been the third UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, and that has rewritten the global agenda in that area for the next generation as well. The Sendai framework builds on the Hyogo framework of the previous decade. A very, very important conference, and one which UNDP went to with a simple message that said, if development isn't risk-informed, it cannot be sustainable development. And we all see the natural disasters which could have been adapted and mitigated around if the development tools and resources had been there, wiping out gains around the world month on month. So the new agenda on disaster risk reduction is extremely important. And then in July, there was the third International Conference on Financing for Development in Addis Ababa, another very important conference, and I'll come back to its outcome later. And at the end of November, early December, we have climate change COP21 in Paris with a new global agreement due to be reached, highly relevant to whether the Sustainable Development Goals can be achieved. So if we take those three agreements in this new agenda and the SDGs, they are all guiding development for the next generation at the global level. The SDGs in particular, and more than any of the other three, I think, have been developed in a very, very inclusive way. In the Asia-Pacific region, for example, Around 3.5 million people took the trouble to participate in the My World survey, which was sponsored by the UN Development System, which asked people about their priorities for the new agenda. 7 ASEAN member countries held national consultations, which the UN system was pleased to support. And in this country, led by the Economic Planning Unit and with the support of the UN country team, Malaysia held consultations in Peninsular Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak, with 8,000 Malaysians directly engaged in face-to-face and online discussions. Across the ASEAN membership as a whole, countries were active in the UN processes in New York, where the new agenda was developed and proposed by an open working group of countries and then negotiated by all member states. So this process of getting to the goals has gone on for something like 3.5 years in a very, very intense manner. And one of the good things about that is there is a high level of ownership of it at the national level. And I could go to virtually every country on earth and hear a deputy foreign minister, a foreign minister, a leader, as we heard today, talk about the commitment to follow through on this agenda. But, as I said, it has some very big challenges in development to tackle. And I want to just speak briefly about 5 which I see as very significant. The first is persistent inequalities and ongoing discrimination. Now, one of the defining features of this agenda is that no one should be left behind. That rising tide for a country should lift every boat in the nation. For ASEAN, well, we can say that many countries in ASEAN made tremendous progress with the MDGs. But the inequalities persist, as they persist around the world. People living in rural and remote areas, members of minority groups, often see less progress than others. And women, who are generally not a minority group, see less as well. And gender equality remains quite a significant drag on development to a country's full potential around the world. Second big challenge, the jobs deficit globally and the implications particularly for young people. Today's generation of adolescents and youth stands at 1.8 billion people, obviously the largest our world has ever seen. And most of the young people live in developing countries. Now, their aspirations, their energy, their innovation can bring a huge demographic dividend to their countries and our world. But isn't the opposite also true? That frustrated, angry, alienated, unemployed, underemployed youth are not a recipe for peace and harmony anywhere. And around our world, unfortunately, youth are disproportionately unemployed and often lack access to affordable and quality services. For the UN, youth potential being realised is really a very, very big issue of emphasis. Third big set of challenges, the mounting environmental challenges, including to our climate, biodiversity, what's happening with the forests clearances, air, water and soil pollution. Human survival and well-being depend very heavily upon ecosystem health, and their deterioration not only has serious environmental implications, it also undermines livelihoods, health and food and water security. And I'm conscious as I speak that today in Kuala Lumpur again, children are not in school. And there's been quite a number of days when children haven't been in school in this season of very, very bad haze. I'm sure it has health effects. It does affect the economy. It's not so much fun to sit on a beach in a haze. And of course it is affecting ecosystems. If there were ever a case study of the need for a sustainable development approach which was bearing in mind the need for the health of the economy, the people and the ecosystem, this problem presents that. And I truly hope that within ASEAN there will be success in getting trans-border solutions to the benefit of all countries. My fourth point, the impact of natural disasters. Asia is the most disaster-prone region of our world. Every country in ASEAN has been affected by major floods or other catastrophes in recent years. including Malaysia, which experienced its worst floods in decades at the end of last year. And then my fifth big area of challenge is our old enemy, war and conflict. The UN has been largely successful in being part of ending war between nations. But conflicts obviously persist. We see them in the headlines of our television news every day. They persist in the form of civil wars and asymmetrical warfare involving non-state actors. Building peaceful and inclusive societies, as Goal 16 of the new agenda envisages, must truly be a major priority. So all these issues, the inequalities, the jobs, the environmental challenges, the natural disasters, and achieving the peace required for development are very central to this new agenda. So, what's going to drive it forward? Well, firstly, broad-based, inclusive and sustainable growth is critical. Asia, of course, has been a major engine of economic growth globally for many years. Agenda 2030, like the post-2015 community vision ASEAN is developing, is an agenda for shared prosperity. Advancing that means focusing not just on the rate of economic growth, but also on the quality of it. How many people are actually benefiting? Economic performance needs to translate much more consistently into the kind of growth which will reduce both poverty and inequality without further damage to the environment. So I think in pursuing a people-centred approach, the following factors could be relevant. Firstly, leaving no one behind, which is a central commitment of the new global agenda, means identifying and then addressing what are often very deep-rooted determinants of exclusion. Tackling entrenched inequalities relating to gender, ethnicity and other factors. It does require proactive policies and investments across education, skills training, sexual and reproductive health services, social protection, the availability of credit, and in all other services which widen opportunity for people. It is truly an inclusive response which is required. Second relevant factor, many trillions of dollars will be spent on infrastructure between now and 2030. It is so important that that investment is risk-informed to avoid setbacks in the event of major shocks, including those being exacerbated by climate change. Risks need to be understood and planned around, and disaster risk reduction needs to be pursued by effective institutions which have the capacity to lead what are often complex and very long-running processes, and certainly full community engagement in design and implementation is very important in effective disaster risk reduction. A third point, innovations and improvements in governance are needed at every level. There is capacity to be built in public administrations. Sweeping policy, legislative and regulatory change is often needed for sustainable development approaches. Whole of government approaches are needed across the economic, social and environmental decision making. This means that the development actors of all kinds need to be working consciously, collaboratively across the broad range of these linked and joined up development goals. And Agenda 2030 will require broad coalitions to be formed across governments, business, civil society, NGOs, multilateral and regional organisations, academia, research, all have a role to play. And I think the major stakeholder meetings, multi-stakeholder meetings like the Global Transformation Forum taking place in Kuala Lumpur this week are very important in providing a space for dialogue about what will it take to build the broad coalitions to transform development prospects. Another factor, how business does business will have a very significant impact on whether the new global agenda can be achieved. And there are so many opportunities for the private sector to engage with the new agenda through inclusive business models and environmentally sensitive ways of operating. Take, for example, the Sustainable Palm Oil Initiative. Vast areas of tropical forest have been cleared for palm oil production over the years, not least in ASEAN countries. But now we estimate that up to 90% of the buying power of palm oil is signing up to deforestation-free supply chains. That carries a very strong message, doesn't it? It says, if you're growing this palm oil on land which has just been deforested, we're not going to buy it. And if 90% of the big global buying power says that, well, there's not much value to that production. So this is a very significant development, which is private sector driven by leaders in the industry, and it's caught on. And the aim will be to expand this approach to other areas of commodity production as well. Another example I would give of very good partnership with the private sector, and there are countless examples, the Philippines Financial Freedom Campaign. So what is this? It's an initiative of the Commission on Filipinos Overseas, the government commission, the Western Union, a major private company, and UNDP, to boost entrepreneurship among Filipinos back home who are receiving remittances from migrant workers. It is now engaging an average of 700,000 to 900,000 Facebook users every week, and it is about supporting inclusive growth and development to benefit from the remittance flow. The new agenda has a big emphasis on accountability, and that means that we all need to pay a lot more attention to producing good quality data and knowledge about what's happening. And also people and groups from all walks of life have an interest in implementing and monitoring what's happening on the goals. And this in shorthand is what's often referred to as the need for a data revolution to go alongside implementation of the new goals. Capacities to analyse data are needed for policymakers, for scrutiny by parliaments, for monitoring by citizens and media, and of course also for empowering citizens as agents of their own development. So let us come to financing. How do you finance an agenda of this breadth and depth? And obviously big ambitions require big investments. I always say money isn't everything, but it does help a lot. The UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, estimates that total investment needs in developing countries in key sectors like food and nutrition, water, sanitation and health over the lifetime of the SDGs will range from 3.3 to 4.5 trillion a year. Based on today's level of public and private investment, developing countries then have to bridge an annual funding shortfall of between around $2 and $3.1 trillion. It's clear to me that public finance alone would not come anywhere near meeting the total financing needs for the transition to the kind of development called for in the new agenda. And it's going to be critical, as it is for development everywhere, to draw on every form of finance which is out there. Some is public, some is private. Some is domestic, some is international. Some is environmental and climate finance, some is straight development finance. We have to find a way to blend it and get the most we can for development across all sources. I think the good news in ASEAN is that there are so many resources and capabilities available in countries and in the region to address development challenges. Overseas development assistance totaled $10 billion in ASEAN in 2013. Not a lot taken across the very significant population of ASEAN, but important still for the least developed countries, which do struggle to raise the domestic finance and attract private finance. But because the official development assistance is obviously rather limited, a critical challenge is to see that it's used in the best possible way. And the best possible way is to build capacity so countries can catalyse raising finance from a wide range of sources. Domestic private capital accumulation and public spending are both showing strong upward trends in ASEAN countries. Net government expenditure is on average nearly 25% of GDP in the region. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which came out of the big Financing for Development conference in July, also recognises the importance of diverse and innovative financing mechanisms, and these could include impact investing and financing mechanisms like green bonds, which combine public and private resources. let us not forget also that Islamic finance has a very important role to play. It has a concern for financial stability, financial inclusion, and shared prosperity. And at UNDP, we see it making a significant contribution across the 2030 agenda. We have a long relationship ourselves with the Islamic Development Bank, substantial partnerships, not least in the occupied Palestine territories, and we're looking forward to doing more with the bank and to supporting it and its instruments to make a difference against the goals. In ASEAN, we see a number of countries already establishing their own frameworks for financing the SDGs. Vietnam, working with UNDP last year, did a development finance assessment to provide evidence and recommendations on how to strengthen management of sources of its finances for development. We have now Philippines, Myanmar and Laos all in the process of implementing similar assessments. In the case of Philippines, this is informing how to finance their long-term vision policy, and in Laos, the assessment is being used to inform the financing framework for their next 5-year plan. There's also the issue of South-South cooperation out of ASEAN, within ASEAN and more broadly. And I'm aware that at the moment both Indonesia and Thailand are reviewing their outward flow of development cooperation and financing and looking at how to promote more effective assistance within ASEAN. We think at UNDP that South-South and triangular cooperation has a huge role to play in the region and beyond in advancing Agenda 2030. We work very actively alongside South-South players and have a number of strategic partnerships with emerging economies in support of that, and would welcome reaching more such agreements with a wide range of middle-income countries, including Malaysia. I just come for a moment to how the UN development system is seeing the role it can play in supporting countries with implementation of the new agenda, because everything rests on what countries do, what governments, what communities at all levels wish to do. We can be helpful at national request, and there's no doubt in the discussions in New York among the member states that they expect the UN development system to be, and the phrase is, fit for purpose for the new agenda. They want us out there and actively involved. So we've drawn up an approach which can be adapted to any context, and we've called it MAPS, because you always need a map to tell you where you want to head. In this case, the MAPS stands for certain things. The M stands for mainstreaming. That's the support we can give to governments at their request to mainstream this huge agenda into national development plans and visions. And I'm happy to say that because of the very high level of ownership and awareness among member states, they were not waiting until agreement in the General Assembly in late September on the new agenda before saying, please, UN country team, come on in, we're writing the plan now. This has been going on over the past year. Help us incorporate this into our new national plan. So that's been very, very encouraging and suggests the SDG agenda is off to a great start. The A in the MAPS is about acceleration. What do I mean by this? Going back around 5.5 years, we developed what we called an Mdg Acceleration Tool. And it was out of our frustration and out of many countries' frustration that they weren't making enough progress on specified goals, specific to each context. And so we developed a multi-stakeholder, multi-sector approach, which didn't ever seek to write any new strategy, policy or plan, because the countries were usually awash with them, and not enough happened as a result of having them, because there are often underlying obstacles and bottlenecks which stood in the way. So when the best minds across all sectors in countries were brought to bear on the problem, you usually worked out what the real obstacle was. And a number of countries, and we worked with over 50 on this approach, were able to speed up progress. So we want to bring this acceleration approach of identifying what the real problems are and tackling them into the SDG process as well. And then the PS in the MAP stands for policy support, because if you think right across the 30-plus entities in the UN development system, there is not an aspect of sustainable development we do not touch on. And just as governments must have a whole-of-government approach to sustainable development, so we will seek to bring a whole-of-UN approach to tackling the rather interlinked challenges that the countries are going to be taking on. UNDP specifically will have a role as mandated by the Secretary-General to produce some guidelines for national SDG reporting. And that's very important because whatever comes out at the global level on these goals or for the regional-wide reporting, it all rests on what are countries reporting, what is the data they have, what are the statistics they have, what do we know about what's happening at the country level. So it's a very important role. And we will keep advocating too for countries to embrace the goals, take them seriously, drive them forward, report on them, engage communities in them. UNDP has hosted for many, many years the UN Millennium Campaign, which promoted the MDGs, and we're currently, of course, reshaping that into a campaign around the new Sustainable Development Goals. So there you have it. This is a big agenda. It's going to take a lot of advocacy, commitment, purposeful action, money, political will, the rest of it. But I think if you look at this agenda, 35 pages, and say, how close is our world to this now, and how different would things be if you could get there, we know the world would be a better place, especially for the hundreds of millions of people who continue to live in extreme poverty. And this agenda says, wipe extreme poverty by 2030, eradicate it. I was just in China on Friday for the Global Forum on Poverty Eradication, which the President sponsored and spoke at. Even since the Sustainable Development Summit at the UN in late September, China has announced that it will seek to reach the goal of poverty eradication by 2020, not 2030. And that means reaching the last mile in China, which is 70 million people. It's a lot of people. But in my experience, when China sets a goal, it's extremely serious about it. So I expect it to be met. And I think no stone will be left unturned. That's the level of ambition that is out there. And I think we're going to need to bring the best brains, share the experiences of what's worked across the wide range of countries to support all countries to lift ambition around this agenda. And certainly at UNDP, we look forward to working very closely with all ASEAN partners on implementation of the agenda, and we see it as entirely compatible with, consistent with this community vision post-2015, which ASEAN is developing around a people-centred agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for your very comprehensive and very detailed presentation on the SDGs. You have shared with us that development is about all of us. You have highlighted the nexus between peace and sustainable development. You shared with us the 5 SDG challenges and the need to build broad coalitions of support to successfully implement the SDG. And your MAPS framework, I think, is a very interesting format, framework to get the SDGs going. We would now take some questions from the floor. Before doing so, may I perhaps start, Excellency, by asking you the first question. If we implementing the SDG at the individual country level, how do you think countries should prioritize the implementation of the SDGs?
Well, this is a very interesting question because there are 17 of these goals and there are 169 targets, and there will be a great many more indicators still being finalised in discussions with the UN Statistical Commission. And I know from my own experience as a Prime Minister that to have 17 goals is to have rather a lot of goals. So Inevitably, I think countries will look at this, and this is why this process of mainstreaming into the national agenda is so important, because it shouldn't stand alone as something different from what countries have in their national plans and visions. We need to see these as integral to progress. So I think inevitably there will be some selection as to what is the top priority for a country. My plea would be to ensure that when countries are doing some strategic prioritising and sequencing, they don't forget the women. That's number one. And the issue is very important to women, like the availability of sexual and reproductive health services and equal opportunity in every sphere. That's the only concern I have, that the almost inevitable prioritising and sequencing might lead to some very important things not getting as much priority in such a broad agenda. But you can count on the UN system to be advocating for, very important constituencies like the women, not to be left behind.
Thank you very much, Excellency. May I ask another question? There's somebody there with a mic available. Yep. Can you please identify yourself? Who did it?
Thank you so much. I am Jafar Ahmad from Myanmar Ethnic Rohingya Human Rights Organization Malaysia, Meherom. Well, I would like to thank you, the Honorable Miss Helen, the former New Zealand Prime Minister, and at the ASEAN, the Executive Officer, also Ashley. Also, I have two questions. One question have we are the one human, the one the UNDP, the sustainable development at the establish the world. We want to human to have the suffering our own land. But how to doing about the the future of the Myanmar, about the one ethnic continue beating up the genocide? Everybody have or the United Nations have they have the evidence for also many time to go to visit about the Arkan state from Rakhine state now. The UN envoy, UN special rapporteur, there are many time to go visit. Many have the evidence to table discussion about the representative of the United Nations, about other UN developed country, the developed program. I have the very frustrated to work about the human activities, the person of the world, the many concern, many time to the comment about the concern is the Rohingya issues, still have behind the suffering and the citizen the rights in the ASEAN, including Myanmar. But what to next step to they come up of your opportunity, they become of the Rohingya, the developing.
I think we've got your point. So your question is on a Rakhine issue. We'll let the.
Sorry, I will add the other one. The question about for your responsibility.
Can we just take one question first? Because there are a lot of people who are queuing up.
No, I said they must come Malaysia. They know soon to come up with the ASEAN meeting, the November. But what step to doing about the Rohingya issues at the ASEAN countries? But now they deny of Rohingya the citizen and coming soon boot the election. But what step your opinion for concern about the Myanmar government? Thank you so much for my question.
Well, thank you for the question. And I have myself visited Rakhine State, and I'm aware of the situation there. I'm also aware that when I look at it, that everyone in Rakhine is poor, and I think you have tensions between two very poor communities, both of whom are minorities in Myanmar. And the UN development system at the moment is working on a whole of Rakhine approach, which might tackle some of those underlying areas of poverty across both the two communities in the state. But but let me say that my understanding of Myanmar tells me that it is undergoing many complex transitions. The politics is in transition, the economy is in transition, the administration of state is in transition and modernisation. It's trying to settle many conflicts which have gone on around its borders for a very long time. It's a very, very complex situation. And the UN is engaged across the issues. There is a political office under Mr. Nambiar, former chef de cabinet of the Secretary General. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights takes an interest and talks about the issues that you are raising. Then we have the development actors and we have the humanitarian actors. So we are involved very, very broadly in Myanmar and in supporting this very, very complex transition that the country is going through.
Thank you, Excellency. The next question.
Good morning. My name is Julian. I'm a student at the Aalborg University in Denmark. And my question is, while we fully understand the universality of Agenda 2030, there are times that the UN agenda might not necessarily drive the government agenda. How do you negotiate with state and non-state parties whose worldview of development might be different from the SDG goals? And how can this goal be advocated in a context where there is a rise of Islamic State? Thank you.
Well, firstly, this agenda was agreed to by every member state of the United Nations. So that's the reality. Everyone's bought into it. And I think that's very, very encouraging. You know, multilateralism hasn't had an easy time in recent years, but this agenda has been agreed to. Now, of course, it's not a treaty. In a way, it's easier to get an agreement on an agenda like this, which doesn't have binding commitments, than it is to get a new climate change agreement, which is of a more binding and treaty type nature. But my impression is that, as with the Millennium Declaration, which I signed on behalf of my little country, and the MDGs which came from that, countries want to try to do their best. And you know, the MDGs have been faithfully reported on by countries for the past, well, let's not say 15 years, because the reporting didn't get going for a little while after they were launched, obviously. But you know, we've seen over 500 national reports on MDGs, and countries wanting to show that they're really giving it their best shot. So I don't have any doubt that this agenda will be taken seriously. There'll be a process at the UN in New York. Every year there'll be some particular segment of the goals looked at, I think, by the high-level political forum. And the proposal seems to be that each year countries would come with something to say about a clutch of 4 goals, and over the course of 4 years you'd cover 16 goals and build up a rolling picture of what's happening. Now, you mentioned, what about countries where Islamic State is a problem? It comes back to that statement in the new agenda that there's no sustainable development without peace. I mean, it's very, very hard to think in Raqqa, in Syria right now, of anyone having Agenda 2030 and the SDGs as their top priority. So achieving peace and stability is a precondition for making progress, and I would really hope that minds would focus on a political settlement in Syria, which might then enable the IS problem to be tackled more decisively.
Hello, my name is Elaine. I'm from ASLI. I would like to ask that the goals are really ambitious, and every country has to commit to delivering huge progress for all. But some studies have shown that 2/3 of people who have not had access to basic services, they live in households that belong under minority, headed by the minority. So that means that being like a member of a certain group, say if you are a girl living in the interiors of Sabah, that means you are likely to be left behind. We see that some governments, right, they may be less willing to tackle these kind of minorities. And in some countries, the political elite deliberately marginalize certain groups. So how would you turn the SDGs into a reality when there is lack of real political commitment?
Well, I think the SDGs are helpful in that there is a goal 10, which is dedicated to reducing inequalities. Now, the MDGs didn't really go near the inequalities issue. It had end points. Every child should be in school, get the death rates for mothers and children down, get the poverty rate down. But I think this agenda focuses us more on saying, well, what are the last mile problems? And it really does mean countries in their planning and policy looking at who's missing out. One of the very useful things UNDP does in quite a number of countries is work with governments and statistics offices to produce an atlas of human development. And that atlas geographically sets out where the differences are and where policy really needs to reach those who've been previously excluded. So I think we can be helpful in supporting identification of where the areas of deprivation are, and then I think engaging in a way which will see communities also have a voice and how they'd like to have that addressed, and have governments look at how they can address the last mile. The last mile is never easy. I'll tell you a little story from my own experience. I was Minister of Housing in New Zealand from 1987 to 89, and I decided to take on poor housing, particularly in the north of the country, where the poor housing was mainly occupied by Indigenous people, and some of it was shocking. I remember going up to a harbour side one day and going to see a young couple with a baby in a house. The wind was blowing through big cracks in the floorboards and the walls. It wasn't fit for any family to be living in. And I remember my officials at the local Housing Corporation office saying to me, "Minister, the people you are asking us to help are very hard to help." I said, "That's why they haven't got decent homes. You must go the extra mile. You must work out how it is that we are going to solve this problem, because it is not acceptable in New Zealand today to have people living like I've just seen on this harbour." So I think there's a combination of political will, recognising that people have been left behind, and then looking at what do you need to do practically to reach those who have been excluded from the progress of the country to date.
Okay, I wasn't sure whether Jarrod was there first or Andrew first. Okay, Jarrod, can you identify yourself?
Good morning, Excellency. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Gerald Joseph, the local NGO Pusat Komas, and I'm also the chair of the ASEAN People's Forum 2015. First, an observation. I think you're right that the means should be the main focus post-MDG. So the question of democracy and governance should permeate actually the whole 17 SDGs, because in Malaysia and ASEAN countries, that's our biggest challenge. What's the quality of democracy? What's the quality of governance? Corruption is endemic here in our country. Elections are not free and fair, and that would be the prerequisite for actually an effective implementation. And I think one of the challenges that you should probably add into that 5 is the political games and charades that happen in international diplomacy. And we know that because many agreements, post-agreement, the actual implementation gets colored by lack of political will, as mentioned by someone. My question then is that this is not new, because in 2000 the UN has adopted a human rights-based approach to development, and I was a little bit surprised to not hear a single mention of that on the human rights approach that actually UN has mainstreamed since 2000. UNDP is supposed to have it as part of your main game plan, but it's been silent in the SDGs. Is there a reason to take away human rights when that's actually a framework for accountability and governance or mechanism in the work of implementation? Thank you.
Well, UNDP does follow a rights-based approach to development. We think there is a right to development. It should extend to every person, no matter what circumstance, what particular group they identify with in a community. I think that the goal 16 is quite important. This is the goal on promoting peaceful and inclusive societies. It's got a number of aspects to it. But take, for example, promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. It's pretty clear. Another target, substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. Another, develop effective, accountable and transparent institutions at all levels. Another, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory and representative decision-making at all levels. As I say, this agenda has been negotiated. Every country's agreed to it. Now, one of the things I think will be important for the agenda across the board is that citizens stay engaged with it and start to talk about the many aspects of the agenda, and in effect, challenge governments, challenge decision makers. I've been a prime minister. I know about the role of civil society. It can be critic and conscience of a country. So I can only encourage you to play your role as you see fit. And I think this agenda is a good agenda in looking at the wide range of factors which impact on sustainable development.
Thank you, Ashley. Let me take a lady's question and I come to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Sarah, and I work for the Bar Council of Malaysia. And my question today is, one of the milestones that was achieved in the International Development Cooperation this year, as you mentioned earlier, was the Addis Ababa International Conference on Financing for Development. So I would like to ask, what are the implications in the outcomes of the conference, and what does it mean for Malaysia specifically?
Well, in my opinion, the outcome from Addis Ababa is actually quite realistic and quite helpful, because it's easy to say that official development assistance targets haven't been met, and it's true they haven't. The target for developed countries to put 0.7% of their gross national income into development is nowhere near met. Maybe it's about 0.3, not 0.7, and only around 5 countries at the present time have actually met that target. So developed countries should meet their obligations. But really this agenda gets to the heart of what is actually financing development. And what is financing it is domestic resource mobilisation, which can take several forms. One is that your economy is growing and the government is able to collect taxation from it. Taxation is, after all, what budgets are based on. You have to get resources in so you can budget them and get them out to priority development purposes. So there is no substitute for a growing economy in a developing country, ideally with a broad base of participation. Now, then to take that next step, which is collecting the taxes for it, you need a tax system. And most definitely designing the capacity for an effective tax system is extremely important, including dealing with international companies. And we all know the examples of those who specialise in paying no tax to anybody, anywhere. And one of the initiatives that UNDP is taking and announced at Addis Ababa with the OECD is a program called Tax Inspectors Without Borders. And this program will enable us to place tax experts, which could be from a developing or a developed country, at the request of another developing country, alongside the national tax authorities to build the capacity to get the international tax revenue in which should be paid. So building capacities for this is extremely important. Another capacity that needs to be built in quite a number of countries is the capacity to design bankable projects. There's actually quite a lot of capital awash out there for investment, but a number of things need to go right. The project's got to be well designed, and often project design capacity isn't as good. So that needs to be invested in as a capacity function. And then there's implementation. You need to build capacities for that. And then to attract investment, whether from one's own citizens or from foreign investors, needs an enabling environment for which the rule of law that Sdg 16 talks about is really rather important, because people want to know that any issues or disputes they have will be dealt with in a proper manner. So underlying this sort of domestic resource mobilisation from the growing economy, collecting the taxes and attracting the investment, being able to do the trade, getting the bankable projects for loans, is a big capacity development agenda, and that's very much the territory that UNDP is in. How to use the official development assistance that is channeled through us to support countries to build their own capacity to achieve these things.
Thank you, Excellency. I see there are 7 people wanting to ask questions. I don't think we have the time to do all of that, as the Excellency has another commitment to attend. But perhaps let me just take the last 3. Please make it very brief. There will be Andrew Koo, Bar Council, Dr. Dennison, and the gentleman who was there standing for a very, very long time. So, Andrew, first, could you identify yourself to the...
Yes, thank you, Chancellor Michael. Andrew Koo, I co-chair the Human Rights Committee here at the Bar Council. My question is simply this. Given that the SDGs, or Agenda 2030 as you call it, are far-reaching, wide-ranging and deep-seeking in the transformation to be brought about, is there still room for the view that in the ultimate realization of these goals, firstly, universal human rights and fundamental liberties can only be upheld, promoted and protected subject to regional and national specificities and particularities, and in any event must respect each country's independence and should not intervene in the domestic affairs of sovereign states?
Well, you're asking the head of the development system, not the Human Rights Commissioner. So but, and UNDP is not a normative agency, by the way. We are a development agency. But one of the roles we do undertake at the request of countries, because we can only work as requested, we do undertake the building and strengthening of national human rights institutions. And national human rights institutions, many aim to aspire to be A-listed against what are called the Paris Principles. And our work is often to help national human rights institutions to build up their independence and capacity to reach those standards so that they can operate in their own country according to those principles. So, you know, there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, the member states have all subscribed to it. We can support national human rights institutions to do their job, to see that those principles are applied at home. And as I say, we do apply a rights-based approach to development, that nobody should be discriminated against for any reason, and everybody should have their rights upheld. And very happy to work in every context on earth to try and advance the basic principles of the Charter.
Thank you. Dennison?
Dennison J. Surya, thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation just now. My question is with regards to monitoring and implementation. Now, the UN, through the Universal Periodical Review, has a very tight mechanism in terms of the UN system reporting on local situation, civil society reporting, and then the country itself doing the reports. It seems that here, once in 5 years, some form of reporting is being done. But to what extent would this reporting, monitoring process be as participatory as the formulation of the SDG has been? There was the open working group process, there were regional consultations, there were at all levels, because the real scope is to what extent would ASEAN countries in general, Malaysia being particular, be open to that kind of scrutiny vis-a-vis civil society, playing a very instrumental role. And whether the UN or the HITS, when they accepted this 15-year agenda, are open to that kind of participatory process, monitoring, evaluation, reporting of that nature. Thank you.
I think that's definitely envisaged, but it will be a work in progress, just like the Universal Periodic Reviews to the Human Rights Council are. And of course, countries are always encouraged to have shadow reports from civil society in that UPR process. Not everyone achieves that. And UNDP and other UN agencies work a lot with countries on their reports to that universal periodic review. Not all countries are as welcoming of civil society participation as others. Some you get a certain way, and then people are not allowed to go to the Geneva process. So it's a work in progress, and I think the citizen engagement in the participatory monitoring and implementation will also be a work in progress. But it will be positive. Things will progress over time. Citizens' voices will be more welcome. One of the big bits of feedback through the whole consultation process on this new agenda was that at the civil society level, people were saying, don't just come and ask us now. We want to stay engaged with us. So don't just ask us what you think should be in it. When it's signed and sealed, we want to keep being part of the process. And as I said, when you're talking about the data revolution for it, part of this is, will civil society have the ability to access data? Will it be able to have the capacity to analyse it? Will it have voice to say what it thinks about it? I'm not thinking that we're going to move from where we are to nirvana tomorrow. But I think there is a very positive attitude by civil society to wanting to build this process. You can see I've been around for a long time. I think a lot of things take time, but incrementally you do see progress.
Thank you. We have time for the last question.
Good morning, Excellency. My name is Voon. I'm from the Center for Public Policy Studies. My question is concerning the UNDP itself, and I just want to ask, what role can the UNDP itself play to realizing Agenda 2030? In your speech, you mentioned issues like inequality being a top priority. Perhaps for the benefit of those who may know the name of the UN, but may not be so familiar with the groundwork, would it be, we appreciate it, perhaps you can explain how we can all support the UN work and how UNDP itself can facilitate the realization of this agenda. Thank you.
Well, UNDP is not only a major program in its own right, it also leads the coordination of the UN development system. So we're sort of working at two levels, if you like, to lead country teams to work coherently and effectively, but also to work on our own mandate. And our own mandate was renewed in the strategic plan which began at the beginning of last year and very much anticipates the Sustainable Development Agenda. So it defines three key areas of work for us: sustainable development pathways, where you try to get this holistic approach across the economic, social and environmental policy. Secondly, the governance that will support that. And thirdly, building resilience to setbacks, which means we're very active in the disaster risk reduction area, but also building resilience to shock more generally does tie you back into some of the issues around inequality and exclusion and lack of voice. When we look at countries that have literally imploded in recent times, it's often a rather toxic combination of economic pressure, a perceived social exclusion, and of course political exclusion as well. Looking at the goals, we have decided that we will put particular emphasis on Goal 1 on poverty eradication, Goal 10 on reducing inequalities, and Goal 16 on achieving the peaceful and inclusive societies. But of course our mandate is a broad one. In middle-income countries like Malaysia, enormous amount of our work is funded through environmental finance streams. But then environmental finance also has a very big bearing on the well-being of communities and of economies. So there are many areas of the goals that we will contribute to through our work, but we feel with the unique mandate we have that goals 1, 10 and 16 are deserving of particular attention.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And Her Excellency, Helen Clark has answered a whole range of questions, and I think it came up very clearly, the focus on inclusive growth, inclusive development, on the protection of the environment, and on the processes that needs to be put in place to ensure that there is peace and sustainable development. I must end this session by once again thanking IDFR, Hajar Naraini, the Acting Director General, your UNDP in Malaysia, Michelle in particular, and Your Excellency Helen Clark for your very candid answers to the many questions that have been put before us this morning. Please join with me to express our appreciation to Her Excellency Helen Clark. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tan Sri. May I now invite Madam Haja Norani Ibrahim, Acting Director General of IDFR, to present a memento to our guest of honor. Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, Madam Norani. Thank you, Tan Sri. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our program. I'd like to announce the departure of Ms. Helen Clark and entourage. We would like to express our sincere appreciation for your presence. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow our VIPs to exit the auditorium. Thank you for your understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, refreshments are served at the foyer area. Please join us and have a great day ahead. Thank you.